I love that, Mel. It's great to be here. So, on behalf of EMBER, I am delighted to welcome you all to today's event. I'm Kerstin Wasson, and I will be starting by orienting you to the place that we'll be talking about for the rest of the day, to Elkhorn Slough. So I'd like to welcome the 60 or so people who are in the room in front of me, who are sitting where the purple arrow is on the slide at Moss Landing Marine Labs. And I'd also like to welcome the people zooming in, most from the local community, but we have some people from all over the state and even from out of state zooming in. We had, at last check, 410 people on Zoom or registered for the Zoom. So there's great interest in this topic. So I will be introducing you to Elkhorn Slough. Most of you know exactly where it is, but for those of you zooming in from further away, we are the only large estuary between San Francisco Bay and Morro Bay on the Central Coast. Estuaries are rare on the California coast. We lie between Santa Cruz and Monterey in the Monterey Bay. So why does the health of Elkhorn Slough matter? Why should you be interested in this? As I mentioned, estuaries are rare in the state, and so Elkhorn Slough provides important representation of habitat types such as eelgrass beds, salt marshes, and intertidal mudflats. And along with that comes rich biodiversity. I had to start with my favorite organisms since I'm an invertebrate zoologist. There are hundreds of different invertebrate species in Elkhorn Slough, including my favorite giant sea slugs out there. But many people are more interested in the vertebrate species. Of course, we have marine mammals, lots of different water birds, including migratory shorebirds, and many different fish species in the estuary. Economically, the estuary provides nursery habitat for flatfish. So offshore catch of flatfish is supported by the habitats in Elkhorn Slough growing the baby flatfish. Economically, ecotourism in Elkhorn Slough is also a huge driver in this area. People come from all over the world to have a close encounter with a sea otter in Elkhorn Slough, as well as for us locally. We come here to kayak and hike and enjoy the beautiful nature. My focus tends to be below the tide line in the estuary itself, but if we back out a little bit, the Elkhorn watershed is home to people and farms and businesses. And this is a good time to acknowledge that for millennia, this area has been stewarded by Indigenous people who took good care of the estuary and the watershed. Colonization had devastating consequences for the native people who lived here, as well as for the estuary, and we are working to heal those relationships with the land and with the people. So what are these impacts I mentioned from colonization on the estuary? The biggest impacts come from farming. Portions of the estuary were diked, meaning their tidal flow was cut off to them. That's their lifeblood. And then groundwater overdraft cut off the freshwater inputs. An estuary is where freshwater and tidal water meet, and both of those were changed. There's also substantial pollution from fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. We have a train line running through the estuary, and this was put in the late 1800s and then facilitated diking of everything east of the tracks because there was already this levee in place. The Moss Landing area, where we are here today, has had some of the biggest impacts. The harbor itself was created artificially in 1946. The Army Corps of Engineers dredged through the sand dunes here to place the jetties and have a deep water entrance to the harbor in line with the Monterey Canyon. And this altered the hydrology of the estuary, increasing tidal erosion in the lower portion. The boats have impacts, anti-fouling boat paint, and inadvertently, the boats transport non-native species from San Francisco Bay to Elkhorn Slough, for example. The power plant has an intake in the harbor area that has effects. And agricultural inputs are a big deal in this area. Actually, the highest concentrations of agricultural pollutants are sort of right outside our door here, because the lower Salinas River, Tembladero, and Gabilan watersheds flow into the estuary there. So we need to understand the battery fire impacts on the background of these other stressors to Elkhorn Slough systems. But not only have there been impacts, there has been a lot of investment in conservation and restoration. Lots of portions of the estuary and watershed are protected. In the red outline, you see the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, for whom I work, which is a partnership between the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, and the Elkhorn Slough Foundation. In yellow, you see lands owned by the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, now the biggest private landowner in the watershed. And in pink, maybe a little hard to see, is the Moss Landing Wildlife Area, also owned and operated by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And the main channel of the slough is part of the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. So all this investment has put us on a trajectory of restoration and recovery. We've restored coastal woodlands and grasslands. Within the estuary itself, we've restored eelgrass beds and oyster beds. We also support tribal members in returning to their rightful legacy of stewardship of coastal habitats. One area of particular investment that's relevant today is salt marsh restoration. And here, as a teacher, I can't help but do a little bit of explaining about salt marshes. So in the past, Elkhorn Slough was dominated by salt marshes, shown in olive green here. But today, or more recently, you can see a lot of those marshes have converted to mudflat, shown in brown, especially east of the railroad track, where it was easy to dike off the lands. These former estuarine lands subsided and sunk, and even after tidal exchange was returned, they were too low to support marsh. So we set about to reverse that on one portion of the reserve, which we call Hester Marsh. Hester Marsh, in the earliest aerial photographs, you see narrow tidal creeks running through dense salt marsh. That's the gray granular matter here. But then after a history of diking and subsidence, it had turned into this shallow, swampy area with algae. It was too low for marsh. So we raised the elevation by adding a lot of sediment. And here is an elevation profile of our ecosystems. If you look at this squiggly line, that's the sort of highest tide, the king tide line. Right beneath that is high salt marsh. And then comes low salt marsh, and then the salt marsh can't withstand too much inundation and you get unvegetated areas. If you look at Hester Marsh, which is this boot here, before restoration, you can see most of it was too low for salt marsh. It was that blue color. In comparison, Yampa Marsh, which was never diked, is dominated by low marsh. After sediment addition, Hester Marsh is now all extremely high marsh. So we have built a sea level resilient high marsh in this place. In fact, if you look at sea level rise modeling, this visualization shows in green the areas that will be salt marsh after 50 centimeters of sea level rise. And you can see the only substantial marsh that will be left is Hester Marsh. While I talked about the important past stressors to the Elkhorn Slough, this is a good time to point out that the biggest future threat to our estuary will be climate change with sea level and other drivers. And so that is, of course, indirectly related to our topic at hand today. Transitioning away from fossil fuels is going to be critical for the health of all our ecosystems and will involve battery storage facilities. Elkhorn Slough Reserve is part of a network of 30 national estuarine research reserves throughout the country. Research is right in our name, and we have lots of experiments and monitoring going on at any time at the reserve. And this was especially the case at our Hester Marsh Restoration site because we were pioneering a new approach and wanted to learn about it. So we set up permanent transects running from upland to creek with 10 quadrats per transect, and we monitor them annually to see how the vegetation is colonizing. As a part of that, we invited many collaborators in to work with us, and that included one Ivano Aiello, who measured the soil composition at those transects purely to understand restoration success, but that poised us to have data from before the fire that you will hear about in just a few minutes. There's other examples. We worked with Beth Watson on a blue carbon study, and she still has lots of pickleweed and soil in her freezer from before the fire as well. So being a hub for research ended up being something useful when an environmental disaster occurred in our backyard. To review a bit of the timeline, and thank you to Max for this slide, the fire at the Vistra battery storage facility, a big 300 megawatt facility, began on the afternoon of January 16th. Some hours later, evacuations were ordered, and then the next day, EPA monitoring began. The fire flared intermittently. Evacuations were lifted after a day. The initial fire burnt out, and the initial round of EPA monitoring concluded. We were able to really rapidly mobilize a team from the Elkhorn Slough Reserve and Foundation, from Moss Landing Marine Labs, and the Alma-Mutsun Land Trust. Within days after the fire, we began collecting data. Ivano with his instrument there. Myself and my students were out there collecting fire debris. There were big flakes of black debris lying on the marsh that we collected and archived. And within days, we began collecting animals to track potential bioaccumulation. As it became clear that the official response would be limited temporally and spatially, and in terms of indicators examined, we committed to studying the battery fire impacts for a few years. And so we gave ourselves an acronym, EMBER, that you're familiar with, and we brought in two additional partners, the Marine Pollution Studies Lab and the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So now we are this consortium of the Elkhorn Slough Reserve Foundation, Moss Landing Marine Labs, Marine Pollution Studies Lab, Aquarium, and the Alma-Mutsun Land Trust, who was there from the start. All of these institutions have provided substantial support for EMBER's work by paying our salaries, by offering facilities and supplies. And we also received generous donations from members of the Packard family and grants from CDFW and the Renewable Natural Resources Foundation, who's providing the food today. So EMBER is your host today for this Moss Landing Battery Fire Symposium. The objective of today's symposium is to transparently share with interested parties, with all of you here and on Zoom, the latest scientific results from investigations of the battery fire. The speakers are all scientists studying the fire, with the exception of our county supervisor, who's saying a few words before lunch. And the scientists this morning are part of the EMBER consortium, and we are focused on the estuarine ecosystem impact, so primarily below the tide line. Then after lunch, you will hear from partners from UCSC and other organizations who looked above the tide line at the watershed and at human impacts. We did invite the county and state scientists studying the fire to participate today, and they all declined. I want to give you a word of warning that this is fairly complicated science you'll be hearing about today. The speakers have all promised to make their work accessible, so I'm reassuring you that at least the first and last slides of every presentation will be very simply stated. What was the question? What were the answers? The graphs in the middle, they have promised to slowly and clearly explain. But please do ask questions if you need clarification or other questions. We are leaving plenty of time that I will enforce strictly for discussion after the presentations. For those of you on Zoom, you can type your questions into the question box, and then there's a little thumbs up sign. So if somebody else has typed in a question that you're interested in, you can thumbs up it, and that'll help us prioritize because we may not be able to get to all the questions that are on Zoom. In person, of course, you can raise your hands. So I know that many of you tuning in today really just want to know the bottom line. And I am going to give you the Cliff Notes summary right at the start. So the first question is, did we find signs of battery fire contamination in the surrounding area? Spoiler alert. Yes. You will hear very compelling evidence from virtually every single speaker today of cathode metal concentrations being elevated in the environment around Elkhorn Slough and in organisms and in human hair. So the answer to this first question is very clear. But of course, the follow-up question that you all have is, did this contamination have negative impacts on wildlife or on people? You will hear much more nuanced and complicated answers to this question. In fact, I would advise you, dear listeners, not to believe anyone or any report that provides a simple no or a simple yes answer to this question. What you will hear today instead is the sausage making of real science. Rigorous scientists, such as today's speakers, do not generalize from limited data. We evaluate data from multiple time points and multiple areas and multiple indicators before reaching conclusions. We cautiously interpret our own data, and we collaborate with others because we recognize that the best understanding will come from synthesis of all available data. So the best answer we can currently provide as a sort of summary statement to today's talk, so the individual ones will differ, is possibly. It's still to be determined. I realize this may be disappointing, but it's honest. I want to end on a hopeful note. To me, it's been really inspiring to see how everyone came together to try to understand this disaster. We were all fully busy already, but added a significant new element to our workloads because we cared. It's beautiful and it's powerful when university scientists, nonprofit partners, conservation groups, a tribe, and the community work together to understand what has happened in their neighborhood. Together, we can take care of Elkhorn Slough and each other. Thank you. Nice.